Racist officer arrests a teen for no reason, instantly regrets it when his captain shows up. The streetlights flickered as 17-year-old Jaden Carter walked home, his backpack slung over his shoulder. He had just finished a late study session at a friend's house and was heading home, thinking about his math test tomorrow. But just as he reached the corner, red and blue lights flashed behind him. A police cruiser pulled up fast, stopping just inches away. Officer Grant, a middle-aged cop with a hardened expression, stepped out. "Hey, you! Hands where I can see them!" Jaden froze. "Sir, Turn around, now!" Grant barked. Before Jaden could react, the officer grabbed his arm and pushed him against the hood of the police car. He felt cold metal snap around his wrists. People on the street stopped and watched. Some pulled out their phones, recording. But what Officer Grant didn't know: the call he just made would bring someone to the scene, someone who would change everything. The cold steel of the handcuffs dug into Jaden's wrists as Officer Grant tightened them unnecessarily. The rough grip on his arm forced him forward, his face almost pressing against the hood of the police car. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated his dark skin, making him an easy target for the murmuring bystanders who had stopped to watch. He could hear the hushed voices, some of them whispering in concern, others pulling out their phones to record the scene. Jaden's chest rose and fell with uneven breaths. He had just been walking home, his backpack filled with textbooks, his mind occupied with his upcoming math test. He had done nothing suspicious, nothing illegal, and yet here he was, being treated like a criminal. His mother always warned him about situations like this, about being careful, about keeping his hands visible, about not making any sudden movements. He had followed all of those unspoken rules, and still, it didn't matter. Officer Grant, standing tall with a smug smirk, looked down at him with a gaze filled with power and prejudice. The officer was in his late 40s, broad-shouldered, and carried himself like a man who had never been challenged. He had patrolled this neighborhood before, but he wasn't here to protect it. He was here to control it. The moment he saw Jaden walking alone, he had already made up his mind. To him, the teenage boy wasn't just another student heading home. He was a suspect, a problem that needed to be handled. The street was quiet, lined with small businesses, a gas station on one side, and a convenience store where a few late-night customers had paused to see what was happening. The bright store lights reflected on the wet pavement, giving the area an eerie glow. A few men stood near the entrance, shifting uncomfortably as they watched the scene unfold. A woman in her 30s clutched her purse tighter, her eyes darting between Jaden and the officer. Some recorded on their phones, knowing that moments like these had become too common, knowing that without proof, stories like Jaden's often went unheard. Jaden tried to keep his voice steady as he spoke, but his frustration seeped through. "Sir, I was just walking home," he said, his voice tight, controlled. Officer Grant scoffed, yanking Jaden's arm higher, forcing him to flinch. "Don't talk back," the officer snapped. "People like you always have an excuse." Jaden bit his tongue. He wanted to argue, wanted to demand why he was being arrested, but he knew that raising his voice would only make things worse. He could already feel the growing sense of helplessness pressing down on him, the weight of injustice settling deep in his gut. He wasn't the first, and he wouldn't be the last. Then the radio on Grant's shoulder crackled to life. A voice came through, firm and steady. "Dispatch to Officer Grant. Captain Rodriguez is en route to your location." The smugness on Grant's face faltered for just a second. His fingers twitched around the cuffs, his grip on Jaden's arm loosening slightly. He turned his head toward his patrol car, as if considering his next move. The confidence he had just moments ago started to waver. Jaden caught the shift in the officer's demeanor. He didn't know much about Captain Rodriguez, but he knew enough. The captain had a reputation, a fair man, but not one to tolerate abuse of power. Grant's reaction told him everything he needed to know. The officer hadn't expected someone higher up to get involved. He had assumed this would be another arrest that no one questioned. For the first time that night, hope flickered in Jaden's chest. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't over yet. Jaden could feel his heart pounding against his ribs, his breath coming in shallow waves as the weight of the situation settled on him. The cold cuffs pinched at his wrists, and the rough grip of Officer Grant on his shoulder kept him firmly in place. His legs felt rooted to the pavement, but not by choice. He knew that any sudden movement, any misstep, could escalate things even further. He had seen stories like this play out before, and they never ended well for people like him. Officer Grant stood tall, exuding a dangerous confidence that came from years of unchecked power. His uniform was neatly pressed, his polished boots firmly planted on the asphalt, and his belt lined with tools that only reinforced his authority. To him, this wasn't an arrest. It was a statement. His narrowed eyes scanned Jaden's face, looking for anything he could use to justify his actions. But Jaden wasn't giving him that. "I didn't do anything," Jaden repeated, his voice firmer this time. He knew it wouldn't make a difference, but something in him refused to let this officer think he had won. Grant scoffed, shaking his head. "That's what they all say." Bystanders had started gathering, standing at a distance, watching cautiously. Some whispered among themselves, others lifted their phones, recording every second. A woman near the convenience store had her arms crossed, her brows furrowed in anger. A man in his 40s, standing beside his parked car, slowly shook his head in frustration. They all knew what was happening. They had seen it before. A young woman, holding her phone steady as she recorded, spoke up. "He wasn't doing anything. You're arresting him for no reason." Grant barely acknowledged her, but his grip on Jaden's arm tightened. "Stay out of it," he barked. Jaden clenched his jaw, inhaling deeply through his nose. His mother always told him to stay calm, to comply, to not give officers like this an excuse. But how was he supposed to stay calm when his dignity was being stripped from him in front of an audience? How was he supposed to stay calm when people like Officer Grant were never held accountable? The flashing lights reflected off the wet pavement, creating long, sharp shadows across the street. The low hum of voices mixed with the occasional honk of a distant car. The world around them continued as if nothing was wrong, as if this wasn't just another night where an innocent black teen was being treated like a criminal. Then, a voice, familiar and frantic, cut through the noise. "Jaden!" His mother. Jaden turned his head just enough to see her running toward them, her face a mix of panic and fury. She was still in her work uniform, a dark blue blouse and slacks, her purse swinging at her side as she rushed forward. Grant stepped between them, blocking her path. "Ma'am, stay back." She wasn't having it. "That's my son. What is he being arrested for?" Grant's lips curled into a smirk, enjoying the power he held in this moment. "Suspicious behavior," he said smugly. "Loitering, maybe resisting." Jaden's mother's face twisted in rage. "Loitering? He was walking home. You have no reason to arrest him." Grant shrugged, clearly unfazed. "Then he shouldn't have looked so nervous when I stopped him." A chorus of protest erupted from the bystanders. More people had started recording. The young woman who had spoken earlier stepped closer. "This is wrong. You can't just arrest people for walking." But Grant wasn't listening. He had already made up his mind. He reached for his radio, preparing to call for backup. Maybe even take Jaden in for further questioning. But before he could press the button, A stern voice crackled through the radio. "Officer Grant, what is your location? This is Captain Rodriguez." The entire mood shifted. Grant hesitated, his fingers hovering over the radio. For the first time, he seemed unsure. The confidence he had carried so boldly just moments ago flickered, replaced by a hint of unease. Jaden's mother noticed the change immediately. Her expression hardened. "Good," she said. "Let's see what your boss has to say about this." The bystanders whispered among themselves, exchanging knowing looks. The tide was turning. A few seconds later, the roar of an approaching car engine filled the street. A sleek, black police cruiser pulled up fast, stopping just behind Grant's patrol car. The door swung open, and out stepped a man with an air of authority that even Grant couldn't ignore. Captain Rodriguez. His dark eyes scanned the scene quickly, taking in Jaden, the bystanders, and then finally Officer Grant. His expression was unreadable, but there was something dangerous in his gaze, something that made Grant stiffen slightly. Jaden could feel the tension in the air shift. Grant had assumed he had full control of the situation. But now things were about to change. The air felt heavier as Captain Rodriguez stepped out of his police cruiser, his polished boots making a firm impact against the pavement. His presence alone was enough to shift the energy of the scene. Bystanders, once murmuring, now waited in complete silence. Officer Grant, who had spent the last 10 minutes exuding confidence, suddenly looked uneasy. Jaden felt his breath steady, just a little. He didn't know much about Captain Rodriguez, but from the way the officer carried himself, he could tell this man wasn't here to play games. Rodriguez took slow, deliberate steps forward, his sharp eyes sweeping the scene. His gaze landed on Jaden, a young black teen, handcuffed, standing rigid with fear and frustration. Then he turned his attention to Grant, who stood tall, trying to mask his discomfort. "What's going on here, Officer Grant?" Rodriguez's voice was calm, but carried authority. Grant straightened, clearing his throat. "Sir, I was patrolling when I saw this suspect loitering near the corner store. He was acting suspicious, so I stopped him for questioning. He became uncooperative, so I restrained him." Rodriguez's expression didn't change. "Uncooperative, huh?" "Yes, sir," Grant continued, regaining some of his arrogance. "Standard procedure. I was about to take him in for further questioning." Rodriguez nodded slowly, looking over at Jaden. "What's your name, son?" Jaden swallowed hard before answering, his voice steady. "Jaden Carter, sir." "And what were you doing before Officer Grant stopped you?" "I was walking home," Jaden replied. "I had just left my friend's house after studying. I live 3 blocks from here." Rodriguez glanced down at the backpack slung over Jaden's shoulders, the weight of books visible inside. His jaw tightened. He turned back to Grant. "Do you have any evidence that he was involved in a crime?" Grant hesitated, but his ego refused to let him back down. "No, but he fit the description of—" Rodriguez's expression darkened. "What description?" Grant's mouth opened, but no words came out. Rodriguez crossed his arms. "Let me be very clear, Officer Grant. You detained a teenager, put him in handcuffs, and humiliated him in front of his community, without a single shred of evidence." Grant shifted, clearly uncomfortable now. The murmurs among the crowd were getting louder. Phones were still recording. Rodriguez wasn't done. He turned to the bystanders. "Did anyone see this young man commit a crime?" The woman by the convenience store scoffed. "The only crime happening here is that cop harassing an innocent kid." A man holding his phone nodded. "He wasn't doing anything wrong. This officer just picked him out for no reason." Rodriguez looked back at Grant, his expression cold. "And you're telling me you saw suspicious activity when every witness here says otherwise?" Grant clenched his jaw, his grip tightening on his belt. He was cornered, and he knew it. Rodriguez took another step forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "Take the cuffs off, now." Grant hesitated. "I said now." His hand shook slightly as he reached for his key, unlocking the metal cuffs and letting them drop from Jaden's wrists. Jaden instinctively rubbed his wrists, the red marks still visible. He exhaled slowly, feeling some of the tension release from his body. Jaden's mother, standing just a few feet away, let out a shaky breath of relief before rushing forward to check on her son. She gently touched his arms, her eyes searching his face for any signs of harm. Rodriguez wasn't finished. "Officer Grant," he said, voice sharp. "Turn around." Grant blinked. "Sir?" Rodriguez pulled out his radio. "I need internal affairs at my location immediately. We have a violation of protocol and an abuse of power." Grant's face turned pale. "Wait, sir, I was just—" "You were just unlawfully arresting an innocent kid," Rodriguez interrupted. "And now you're going to face the consequences." Jaden couldn't believe what he was hearing. His mother let out a shaky exhale, whispering, "Thank you," though she still held on to her son protectively. The bystanders erupted into applause, some cheering, others just relieved to see justice finally served. Grant, now humiliated in the very way he had tried to humiliate Jaden, stood frozen. For the first time that night, he was the one feeling powerless. Officer Grant stood stiffly, his face drained of color, as the realization of his situation sank in. The power he had wielded just moments ago, the smug confidence with which he had arrested Jaden, was gone. In its place was something else. Fear. Captain Rodriguez kept his eyes locked on him, his expression unreadable but firm. "I'm going to ask you again, Officer Grant. What was the reason for this arrest?" Grant swallowed hard, his throat dry. He glanced around as if searching for support, but there was none. The bystanders who had once stood in silent frustration were now fully engaged, some still recording, others watching with satisfaction, as the corrupt officer finally faced the consequences. Grant stammered, his voice lower than before. "I thought he was acting suspicious." Rodriguez let out a slow, deep breath, shaking his head. "Suspicious? A teenage boy walking home, carrying a backpack full of school books, in his own neighborhood." Grant clenched his fists. "I was just doing my job." Rodriguez took a step closer, his presence towering over Grant. You were abusing your badge. You saw a black teenager walking alone, and you assumed the worst. Without evidence, without cause, you humiliated him. And now, you want to call that doing your job? Jaden, still standing with his mother beside him, watched the exchange with cautious relief. His mother's hand rested gently on his arm, as if still protecting him even though she knew the fight was finally turning. Rodriguez turned to the officers who had arrived at the scene, standing near their patrol cars. "Did any of you witness any crime before Officer Grant put this boy in cuffs?" The officers exchanged hesitant glances, shifting on their feet. Finally, one of them shook his head. "No, sir. We only arrived after the call." Rodriguez nodded. "That's what I thought." He looked back at Grant. "You don't get to play judge and jury. You don't get to humiliate people because of your own prejudice. Not under my command." Grant exhaled sharply, frustration flickering in his eyes. "Sir, I've been on the force for 20 years. I've made arrests like this before. No one's ever questioned it." The crowd murmured, anger rising again at the officer's words. He had admitted it. This wasn't the first time. Rodriguez's jaw tightened. "Well, today, that ends." He reached to his belt and unclipped his radio. "Dispatch! I need internal affairs at my location immediately." Grant flinched. "Captain, wait!" Rodriguez cut him off. "Hand over your badge and gun, Officer Grant. You're done." The street went completely silent. For a moment, Grant didn't move. His entire career, his authority, his power was being stripped from him in front of everyone. The badge on his chest, once something he wore with misplaced pride, now felt heavy. His hands trembled as he reached for it, unpinning the badge and setting it down on the hood of his patrol car. Then, with even more reluctance, he removed his gun holster, placing it beside the badge. Rodriguez's voice was firm. "You are officially suspended, pending an investigation. You will not be returning to duty." Grant's lips pressed into a tight line, but he didn't argue. He knew it was over. Jaden let out a shaky breath. His mother's hand tightened around his. The injustice wasn't erased, but at least for the first time there were consequences. The bystanders, once filled with quiet dread, now stood in silent victory. Some nodded in approval. Others whispered, "About time." Rodriguez turned to Jaden and his mother, his expression softening. "I'm sorry this happened to you." Jaden, still processing everything, nodded slowly. His mother wiped at her eyes, a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "Thank you," she whispered. Rodriguez looked back at the crowd. "If you recorded what happened tonight, I encourage you to submit the footage to Internal Affairs. The truth needs to be documented." The young woman holding her phone nodded firmly. "We already have." Rodriguez turned back to Jaden, meeting his eyes. "You deserve better than this." And with those words, justice, true justice, was finally set in motion. The tension in the air slowly began to ease, but the weight of what had just happened still lingered. Jaden stood beside his mother, his wrists still sore from the handcuffs, his heart still pounding from the adrenaline. He had been walking home just moments ago, and now he had been at the center of something he'd only ever seen on the news. Officer Grant stood near his patrol car, his once proud shoulders now slumped. His badge and weapon lay on the hood, stripped from him in front of everyone. He kept glancing around, as if hoping someone would come to his defense, but no one did. The silence around him wasn't just from the bystanders. It was the sound of his authority crumbling. Jaden's mother let out a shaky breath, pulling her son into a tight embrace. "Are you okay, baby?" she whispered against his forehead. Jaden nodded, but in truth, he didn't know how to feel. He was relieved, angry, shaken, and exhausted all at once. "I think so," he finally murmured. Captain Rodriguez stepped closer, his gaze steady. "Jaden, I need you to know something." Jaden looked up, meeting the captain's eyes. "This should have never happened," Rodriguez said firmly. "And if I have anything to say about it, it will never happen again under my watch." Jaden swallowed hard. It was the first time an officer had spoken to him with respect, rather than suspicion. Rodriguez turned to the crowd. "If anyone else here has ever been mistreated by law enforcement, I encourage you to report it. This is not how we serve our community. And if there are officers who think they can get away with this, they are wrong." A few murmurs of approval spread through the crowd. People exchanged looks, some nodding, others pressing their lips together as if holding back emotions. The young woman who had recorded everything stepped forward. "I already sent the footage to Internal Affairs," she said. "This time, there's proof." Rodriguez gave her a nod of respect. "Good. That's exactly what we need." Jaden's mother turned toward him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "What happens now? What happens to him?" She gestured toward Grant, who still stood by his patrol car, silent and defeated. Rodriguez glanced at the disgraced officer before responding. "He'll be placed under formal investigation, and I can assure you he won't be coming back to this job. Not after tonight." Jaden exhaled deeply. He had seen so many stories like this before, But rarely did he ever see real consequences. For once, something was actually being done. Rodriguez turned back to Jaden and his mother. "I know an apology isn't enough, but I am sorry for what you went through tonight. You deserve to feel safe in your own neighborhood." Jaden's mother nodded, her eyes still wet with emotion. "Thank you, Captain," she said softly. Rodriguez gave a final glance at the crowd, then signaled for the officers to begin dispersing. The bystanders, some still murmuring amongst themselves, began to slowly walk away, the tension in the air gradually dissipating. As Jaden and his mother started heading home, he could hear snippets of conversations from the remaining bystanders. That officer finally got what he deserved. "This is the first time I've actually seen justice happen in real time. I hope they do more than just suspend him." Jaden didn't say anything as he walked, but he felt something shift inside him. Tonight could have ended so differently. If Captain Rodriguez hadn't shown up, if no one had recorded, if people hadn't spoken up. He didn't even want to think about what might have happened. His mother wrapped an arm around his shoulders as they walked. "I hate that this happened to you," she whispered. Jaden nodded, but after a moment he said, "At least people saw it. At least they cared." His mother sighed. "I just wish you didn't have to go through it at all." Jaden agreed. But at the same time, he had learned something tonight. Silence allows injustice to continue. The people who had recorded, who had spoken up, who had refused to look away, they had made a difference. And if something like this ever happened again, he wouldn't just stand there and take it. He wouldn't let fear keep him from speaking up for himself or for others, because change only happens when people refuse to stay silent. As he and his mother turned the corner toward their home, he felt different, stronger. Tonight had shaken him, but it had also opened his eyes, and he would never forget it. Tonight could have ended differently. Jaden Carter was just a teenager walking home, minding his own business. But in a world where prejudice still exists, that was enough to make him a target. Officer Grant thought he had full control. He thought no one would question him. He thought he could get away with it, just like before. But this time, people refused to stay silent. The bystanders recorded. The community spoke up. And Captain Rodriguez proved that real justice still exists. Because power isn't about control, it's about responsibility. And those who abuse it, they always face the truth in the end. What would you have done in Jaden's place? Have you ever seen someone get treated unfairly? Would you have spoken up? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, don't keep it to yourself. Like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories about justice, resilience, and real change. Because standing up for what's right isn't just an option, it's a responsibility. Until next time, remember, silence allows injustice to continue, but one voice can change everything.